Okay, so we're recording now, and it's our second class together. I'm looking forward to continuing. Really great discussion last week, and I look forward to continuing this week. So last week, we began, I remember we're speaking about end-of-life issues in public policy. And one of the things I try to argue is that the historical discussion about medical research and autopsies somehow, impacts the culture of the way that Jews think about and address the issue of public policy and end-of-life care. I mean, it was a really traumatic event in some ways. On the one hand, there's this promise of medical progress from medical study of the body and anatomical research. On the other hand, it comes up against certain deeply held beliefs about the sanctity of the body. And then you have the political ramifications of this complex dynamic in which, people, there are countries around the world or medical schools or cities that are demanding the Jews contribute their share of corpses to study, which raises all sorts of tensions with the broader society in which we live in. And I try to argue that the whole conversation took on a different dynamic once it moved to the Jewish state. Because when it moved to the Jewish state, if you didn't have Jews donating the bodies to science, or at least to the medical schools, then you just weren't going to have medical schools, at least at the time before we had 3D imaging. So the whole dynamic changes there in that context. And I think one could argue that we're going to see something like that today as well, when it comes to the issue of posthumous organ donation. To be clear, I'm not referring to right now living donation, such as most prominently with a kidney or with a liver lobe, but here I'm referring to posthumous organ donation, meaning a person has passed away, and we have the incredible ability to slow down the process I'll describe momentarily in a way in which we can still retrieve or recover organs before the person is buried and give them to someone else and bring life to them. Okay, so this started in the 1950s. If I'm not mistaken, Pittsburgh was the place where the first liver transplant took place. But most famously, in 1968, we have, sorry, let me just pull this up. We have, why can't I get this? Sorry, one second. Here we go. Yeah, we have in 1968 the famous first organ heart transplant. Okay, shouldn't be organ transplant, heart transplant of Dr. Christian Barnard in South Africa. And this leads to a humongous debate and discussion over the propriety of what he did. Okay? Now, this is a tremendous opportunity because there are many, many people who on a given year pass away waiting for an organ. Could be a heart, could be kidneys, could be liver, could be lungs, small intestines, whatever it might be. There are also other opportunities to donate, like skin or a skin bank or cornea, heart valves. There are a lot of things that we can transplant today. That technology is only developed further. But the question became is the person actually dead in order to allow this? So let's explain a little bit of the discussion. Traditionally, over the centuries, the human organism, their major critical systems would shut down pretty much simultaneously or one after another. So if you stop breathing, soon after, for example, your heart is going to stop beating as well. And that's just how it always was. There's no reason to think otherwise. Now, one of the incredible technologies that begins to develop in the beginning of the 20th century is the ability, the way I think about it is to parse out the process of dying and separate those parts. Okay? And this is made possible in many ways by artificial life support. which is best probably thought of most classically, not only, but classically with the ventilator. Right? So all of a sudden now we have this opportunity where a person could stop breathing, which normally would mean the heart would stop functioning and all the cells and everything would stop functioning soon afterwards. But because of this powerful machine, the artificial ventilator, right, we can keep a person, we can keep air coming into the person. And since, especially since the heart is independent, the heart can keep on going. And therefore, while the organism might be on the process of starting to stop functioning, the organs themselves remain functioning. And so the question then becomes, along this process, where do you draw the line and say, okay, the dysfunction of the organism now means that the organism is dead? Now, if it was with regard to, let's say, a pig or another type of animal or an ant or whatever it might be, a lizard, like the answer would be, we don't really care. Right? This isn't so critical to know, right? When is a lizard dead? But when it comes to human beings, of course, this has a lot of implications. In general, for us, for Jews, for everyone around the world, right? Understanding when mourning practice come in. And starting in the 50s, the debate comes is, where do you draw the line? Because if you can draw the line at a certain point where the organs are still functioning, but you can argue that the organism, the human, has died, then you can retrieve these organs and transplant them into someone else. This is not a scientific question. This is a question of a legal or cultural or religious or ethical question. Where in the process of dying you draw the line to say that the person is dead? And different countries and different cultures can, make that decision in different places. But largely because of the promise of organ transplantation, there's a push to say that brain death, which is, we'll explain what that means momentarily, is the criteria for death. Now, what I mean by saying it's a criteria for death, which means as follows: a person is non-responsive to their environment, which we can test clinically, right? Which is different, for example, from a person who's in a coma or PDS, a permanent vegetative state. They have some form of reactions to the outside, to stimulus. In the case of brain death, one of the things they test is to make sure the person is totally non-responsive and that they'll never again breathe autonomously on their own. You have two factors, right? Both of they're unresponsive to the environment around them, and they'll never again breathe autonomously on their own. Now, it looks like they're breathing because they have this artificial ventilator, but they will never again breathe on their own. Is this sufficient? Because if you look at a person who's brain dead, it's really, the term shouldn't be brain dead. It really should be brain stem dead, because that's really the area that we care about. The brain stem, which is the part of the brain and really control the nervous system that really controls autonomous respiration. It's probably also the seat of consciousness, interesting enough. But what really matters for us is the fact that the person won't breathe again on their own. In Israel, in fact, the law is called respiratory brain death, because we want to make sure it's understood. We don't care about the brain so much. We care about respiration. So do you say that this critical functioning of breathing is sufficient criteria for death? Or do you look at this person and say, listen, the heart is still beating, the body's still warm. This might be true because we're doing this through artificial support, but they are, but nonetheless, we can have to still consider them to be alive. Or do you say no, right? The fact that we have this powerful technology doesn't make them any more alive. And it's a real question. I literally, what day is today? Sunday? On Wednesday or Thursday, I was having a conversation with a tragic situation, part of my organization, Ematai, which used to be the Halakha Organ Donor Society. We're very involved in hospice organ donation. And I'm literally talking to a person who's tragically, their sibling had passed away very suddenly. And she's describing to me how in the hospital, the father of the deceased is looking at their child and saying, there's a heart beating here. The body's warm, right? My child is still alive. Whereas another sibling who's in the room is looking at this person and saying, like, why in the world are we still in the hospital? My sibling is dead, right? Like, this is just a dysfunction. So you can understand, if you haven't thought about it, particularly in advance, right? It's a very traumatic type of experience, right? And very sad. In the end, by the way, they donated, and 4 people are living today because of that brave decision. So this is literally a matter of life and death in all sorts of directions here. And that's why it's so important in my mind to speak about it and teach it and think about this issue, because organ donation is literally a matter of life and death. I was just speaking last week to the head of one of the heads, senior figures of the organ transplant network in Ontario. And she was describing to me how, particularly over COVID, the number of organ donors went down. That's for a lot of different reasons. And now, because of that, right, the number of deaths, though, have gone up, right? This is a critical matter. In the United States alone, 17 to 20 people a day die waiting for an organ. Okay? So this is literally a matter of life and death. And the question becomes, how do Jews understand this issue? Knowing full well, by the way, that we're going to benefit from such a system. Okay, but just because we could benefit from a system doesn't mean that we necessarily should take part in it. So I'll give you an example. This actually was discovered by, or revealed to the world by, an Israeli transplant surgeon named Jay Lavi. Jay, who I know, he's still active in Shiva Hospital in Tel Aviv. So Jay has a patient come to him one day and says, I'm going to get a heart in 3 weeks. And Jay goes to him like, it doesn't work that way. Like, we don't know when someone's going to die in the state where the body can, He's like, no, I have it all set up. My insurance is paying for it. I'm going to China in 3 weeks. You get a heart. Jay goes like, what are you talking about? Anyway, he does a little research, and it turns out that in China, and this is still going on today, unfortunately, the Chinese were killing in a very carefully manner, right, political prisoners, the Falun Gong and others, in order to then sell their body parts. Right? If you look at Tablet Magazine, do a Google search for Jay Lavi, China, Oregon, you'll see he had a whole recent article on this, both in academic journals and in popular journals as well. Clearly, that's usser. Clearly, that's forbidden, right, to take part in it. So you might say, yeah, but at least it's going to save a life. Answer, no. There are certain things we don't do, even in order to save our life or someone else's life. Okay, so the question becomes, right, for us, not just for Jews and for citizens of Canada, America, Israel, England, wherever it is around the world, do we accept this concept of brain death, allowing for organ transplantation under the assumption that we will only transplant an organ if a person is dead? That's known as the dead donor rule. Okay. Now, I don't want to get too much into this right now, but the dead donor rule, unfortunately, is being, how should I put it? Well, sort of abandoned, actually. I don't know how else to say it, because in various countries around the world, there are different cases in which we're allowing people who are perfectly alive, but to die in a very careful manner, controlled manner, to allow for organ donation. One of them actually happens to be Canada, because with MAID, medical assistance in dying, when it's done via euthanasia, so there is an opportunity for organ donation, which means that every year now, past few years, there have been a number of cases of organ donation, which was done via euthanasia. Now, you may agree with this, disagree with this. We'll discuss this a little more next week, but that's just a reality to keep in mind. But in any case, on the assumption that we only will take an organ from someone who's died, the question becomes is, has this person met the criteria which we demand in order to say this person has died and we can retrieve the organs? Okay, so this is what's at stake. And already in the 50s, this becomes a live issue because of the first liver transplant, but particularly, I'm not sure, I think it's because of it sort of represents something. The heart is seen as like it's the source of life, it's the source of blood, right? Circulation. The heart has a certain symbolic significance in a way that let's say, liver doesn't. Okay, and so this issue becomes a very prominent issue. And there's a whole history here. I want to try today give you a little bit of an overview of where we stand on this issue and where the different parties are. Okay, so in the ultra-Orthodox world, the Haredi world, however term you want to use, by and large, they do not accept brain death criteria. Okay, I have here a couple of very important writings of prominent poskim in Yerushalayim, but already the truth is, already in the 60s, there are some who are opposed to it from the get-go, who felt that this was double murder. It was the murder of the donor. It was also a murder of the recipient, because at the time it was so experimental, many of the recipients were dying as well. And so they just were against this whole process. Like, why are you doing this? You're just killing people, both doubles. But even as technology advanced and the recipients now are living, there are many who felt that Halakha wouldn't accept brain death, brain stem death as the proper criteria. We'll see a little bit later on why that would be. And therefore, they said, listen, you cannot donate organs. Okay, now, the obvious question which you're going to ask, which I'm going to raise, which is an uncomfortable question, is, well, if you can't donate organs because we don't accept brainstem death, does this also mean that you cannot accept organs? And that would be a sort of a logical conclusion, the same way that you can't accept organs from, in China. And the answer here is no, they didn't make that equation. And by and large, in various ways, the ultra-Orthodox rule will not donate, but they will receive. Okay? Under the argument that, well, if they're going to take their organs anyway, or be declared anyway dead, then we're not causing the death of the patient. This is a very legalistic people, if you will, to try to explain this. I also happen to think it's not accurate, because you don't just stop like automatically get an organ. You have to register for it. You have to sign up for it. In different countries around the world, your insurance pays the doctor to do this, or the hospital, whatever it might be. So it's not like it just happens. Like, it's done for you. But whatever. But that's the situation. Okay, and we'll come back to this point a little bit later on. Now, when I say that this is the current ultra-Orthodox position, that's certainly true, but it didn't have to be that way. Okay? And this is sort of a real great tragedy in many ways that became this way. And it really, this issue should have been decided in some ways, or at least been largely influenced by the great posek, great decisive of Jewish law, and Moshe Feinstein, who passes away in 1986. And initially, if you look up here in the top left corner, you'll see that he initially in 1968, not when he's dealing with brain death cases, okay, but he's dealing with cases where they didn't think it was brain death, the person was just in very bad shape, he says it is absolutely forbidden to donate organs. However, in 1976, right, as the technology keeps on developing, right, he writes a tshuva to his son-in-law, man on the right here, Rabbi Moshe David Tendler, who's not only Rosh Yeshiva, but also professor of biology. And he tells Rabbi Tendler, I think actually that respiratory criteria is the proper criteria. And therefore, if a person is not going to be able to breathe again on their own and is unresponsive to the environment, they are in fact dead. Okay, and he actually affirms this in a couple of letters to the state assemblyman Mel Miller, and later on in 1985 to another doctor. Now, if you go to the HODE's website, the Halachic Organ Donor Society, which again we're evolving into Ematai, but that website is still alive and well, you'll see on it many videos in which Rabbi Feinstein, people who talk to Rabbi Feinstein, including his son, Rabbi David Feinstein, his son-in-law, Rabbi Moshe David Tendler, 4 different doctors and others say, we spoke to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein on this issue personally. And he told us he accepts the respiratory criteria for death. But unfortunately, for various reasons, which are somewhat hard to understand, although there was a little bit of ambiguity in some of his writings and confusion, Rabbi Feinstein's ruling was been disputed, meaning not what he said, but rather did he say it at all? There's been a whole movement, particularly in the ultra-Orthodox world, to discredit those responsa, which is a great, great, great tragedy in my mind, because I can't think of any other examples in the current history of Halakha in which the sons and the son-in-law were all close with him, all say he said this, 4 doctors affirm that he said this, his writings indicate it, and yet people don't accept that as his position. But that's the reality. Okay. And so in certain circles, right, they dispute that. Now, having said that, in Israel, there's much support actually for organ donation. And this has particularly been driven by the chief rabbinate of Israel. So if you look here, you'll see a number of successive chief rabbis, probably under the influence of what they believe to be Moshe Feinstein's position, including the Sephardic community, but not only, of course, have affirmed this idea of the respiratory criteria, brainstem death, and say, therefore, is a mitzvah to donate organs in such situation. And not only is it in the chief rabbinate, but it's also been accepted very broadly in the religious Zionist world, in Israel at least. And so the religious Zionist rabbis in Israel disagree about everything, right? We disagree about conversion standards. We disagree about kashrut standards. We disagree about Shemitah issues. We disagree about what bracha do you say on Bamba. We disagree about everything, and that's fine. But there's one issue which the religious Zionist rabbis agree across the board, and that's the respiratory brain death criteria and the mitzvah of organ donation, which is a pretty remarkable phenomenon. I want to come back to this as we move forward. I mean, why would that be? Why would it be that everything, every issue, right? Religious Zionist rabbis disagree with each other on one issue. It's really the only issue I can think of. And besides a general positive outlook on the state, but of all great disputes in Jewish law and halakha, this is the only issue which the religious Zionist rabbinate seems to agree on. Very puzzling. Okay? Now, I'll suggest that this is for 3 reasons. One of which is that the rabbis who first allowed it, the initial chief rabbis in 1986, were very influential in the religious Zionist community. It was the last time where the religious chief rabbinate council was really dominated by religious Zionist senior figures. And that had a big impact. But I think the other big impact was also that, if you don't accept brain death in New York, do Jews die? No. Yes, but no, because you have plenty of suppliers of organs, right, coming from the broader, much larger non-Jewish population. Right? So if Jews in Montreal don't donate, but you're still going to be part of the system. Right? You'll still be able to receive organs from the broader Montreal community. In Israel, if you don't have Jews donating, no one's donating. And particularly when you take into account as well that various Muslim groups or members of the Arab population, for their own cultural or religious reasons, also don't support organ donation. So you have a situation where if the Jews aren't donating, the chief rabbi doesn't come out and support this, a lot of people, Israelis, are going to die. It's just the way it works. And by the way, there are countries in the world where this phenomenon exists. So for example, it's changed a little bit, but in Japan, for various religious and cultural reasons, they don't really support organ donation. And the organ donation rate in Japan is very, very low. Now, in Israel, thank God, because of the work of my organization or other organizations, right, the numbers have gone up a lot. So 2022 statistics just came out, and we're up to about 56% of those who died from brain death who elected to donate. Now, that's lower than it is in Canada and many Western countries, where it's about 70 to 80%. but it's a much bigger improvement still. Okay. Now, I want to also keep in mind that brain death, brainstem death, respiratory brain death happens not that often, because in order for it to happen, you have to die in a certain way where they get you to the hospital fast enough and your body's in proper condition where they can get you into a ventilator and stabilize you enough to to get you stabilized, so that way the heart doesn't stop beating. And your body has to be in good condition, right? So I just met today with, I had lunch today with Stephen Flato. Stephen's a lawyer he splits time now between New Jersey and Jerusalem. You might recall his daughter, Elisa Flato, Zichronah Livracha, was murdered in a terrorist attack in 1995. Some may remember that. And the way it ended up happening was the way that it hit her, killed the brainstem, but her body, she was, I think, 20 at the time, was in perfect condition. So they were able to donate, I think, 6 or 7 organs. Okay, but it doesn't happen every day like this situation. So, for example, in the state of Israel, on a given year, there'll be about 450 cases of brain death, or cases of, I think it's brain death, but only about 180 of them are in a condition, the bodies, where they can donate organs. So you realize you're not talking about once every other day, population of 9 million people. It doesn't happen every day, right? So every time it happens, it's a tremendous opportunity, but only if people are going to support it. So let's understand a bit deeper, meaning this debate, where does this whole debate come from? So I think that there are what I call a set of surmountable barriers to this issue. And what I mean by this set here is that it's just an acronym, right, to help us remember what I think some of the issues are. Let me actually pull it up here. It's a little bit easier for you to see. Okay, and the set is like this. So the superstitions. The superstitions are very, very harmful. So, for example, I don't mean that Tchiyat HaMetim, resurrection of the dead, is superstition. That's a classic traditional Jewish belief, of course. But there are people who are nervous that if you donate organs, then your body won't be able to be resuscitated at the time of Tchiyat HaMetim. Now, what am I supposed to say about that? But I hate to reveal it to people, but all of our organs decompose actually rather quickly in the first year after people die. So the Ribbono Shel Olam, right, the master of the universe, who can resurrect the dead, is going to find a way to bring back our organs as well. And if you even want to get deeper into this, like, does anyone think that the martyrs of the Holocaust who are cremated aren't going to be able to be brought back to the dead, right? It's a preposterous theological idea, but nonetheless, people, especially if you haven't thought about it beforehand, get very nervous about it. Or they'll get nervous and say, how can I sign an organ donor card, or even talk about this within the family, which is really the most important thing to do, to talk about within the family, because it's like an evil eye in Ayin Hara. And when people say this to me, I ask them, like, well, did you ever sign life insurance? Or, house insurance, or fire insurance, or flood insurance? Right? All of these things, those documents say very clearly, if I die in X, Y, and Z way, right? So you're going to do all of those things as well. You're not worried about the Ayin Hara there. You shouldn't be worried about the evil eye here as well. But I cannot tell you how many people get very, very nervous to talk about organ donation and to talk about death in general. Right? It's just one of those things that people, they think it's either bad for their karma or Ayin Hara, or whatever it might be. And this is a major issue, which we have to overcome. And it's not just, of course, Jews, right? Many people have this issue, and that's what I call the S, the superstitions, right? The beliefs that these things are going to harm us, as it were, by talking about it. The second factor, of course, is the emotions, the E, right? That's obviously very difficult, particularly if you haven't thought about it. Most cases of organ donation, brain death, is a sudden death, okay, or a surprise incident. It's not like you have cancer for 4 years and something like that, or whatever it might be. In those cases, organ donation, the body isn't, it's not relevant here. So someone woke up one morning, they're fine, they have a brain aneurysm, whether it's a car accident or a bicycle accident or an overdose, whatever it might be. These are very, very difficult situations. And of course, emotionally, it's very difficult for people to wrap themselves around this idea. And then the third element is what I call the T, right? The set of surmountable barriers is a T, which you can either refer to as the 3 prohibitions, right? Or the triad of taboos, if you will, however you want to remember it, but all of which with T, right, talk about there's many three prominent prohibitions that relate to our obligation to recognize and respect the sanctity of a corpse. This includes not desecrating a body, nivul hamet in Hebrew, not delaying burial, halanat metim, and not deriving benefit. Right? If you take an organ, aren't you benefiting from it? Aren't you desecrating by opening up the body? So all of these are issues in theory, right? And these are more serious, but right, all of this gets trumped by the notion of saving a life. Right? In Hebrew, pikuach nefesh. Right? Pikuach nefesh overrides these things. Now, remember, last week, for those of us who were with us last week, when we talked about autopsies. So remember, we asked this question, well, wait a minute, maybe the knowledge that we gain over time from medical research is pikuach nefesh. And we saw that many felt that, no, it's too distant, it's too theoretical. But in our case, organ donation, there's no such thing as an organ bank when it comes to these life-saving organs. In fact, it's a highly orchestrated, very, very time-sensitive process. And so this is immediate pikuach nefesh, and organ donation supersedes all these prohibitions. Okay, and moreover, you can even argue: is it really nivul hamet, desecrating the bed? I mean, this isn't like I know people image you have like they're grabbing someone's heart. No. And this isn't some like The Last Mohican, right? If you know the movie, right? Am I dating myself when I refer to The Last Mohican, the movie? In any case, if you know it, you know it. Terry, I think you know the movie. It looks like you're knowing it, right? You have no idea what I'm talking about. Okay, never mind. In any case, so this is done in an orchestrated manner in a hospital, in the operating room, and people can have full burial rights afterwards. It does take a couple of days, right? It can take a little bit of time. But all of thise things get overridden by the notion of pikuach nefesh. So those things are totally surmountable. But I stress this because for many, many people, the issue is not, do I accept brain death or do I not accept brain death as a halakha criteria, as a religious criteria. For many people, for many Jews, not just religious Jews, Jews in general, the issue of bodily integrity is a real barrier. So, there are many cases like this of conversations where people just tell the people in the hospitals, like, Jews, we have to be buried whole. Which is true in general, right? And true in general, we should take care to bury, someone whole and bury all the body parts. And, the Israeli army, for example, will do everything they can to retrieve, any bodies or body parts, or if there's a bus bombing or bombing in Israel, Zaka or other emergency personnel will literally, go comb the road, the area to find whatever needs to be buried and bury it. And that is a mitzvah. But that mitzvah gets trumped by the value of saving lives. And it's very important to stress this point because so many people have this belief, which is a true belief, but again, only in certain circumstances. It's usually true, except when pikuach nefesh is relevant here. Okay, and so that's why I call these it's very important to keep in mind the superstitions, the motions, and the 3 prohibitions are surmountable issues. The biggest question, like I said beforehand, is do you consider this person to be deceased? And here again, we as a people have accepted brain death to receive organs. So if that's the case, how do you receive but not take? I know my own teacher, Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, was a great, great sage who passed away several years ago now. But my own conversations with him about this, he emphasized to me, he wasn't so sure that there was a clear criteria in Halakha to tell us that we accept respiratory standard. But he said, if you're going to take organs, you have to give people also the option to donate organs as well. So let's take a look at the halachic sources here for a minute to understand where that comes up. But we have a small group here, so if I want to take a moment, take any questions until what I've said until now. Anyone want to take a question?
I have a question.
Please go ahead, Michaela.
So you were talking about the ultra-religious before, saying how they have rejected the notion of the brain deaths. So then the whole pikuach nefesh would not relate to them in donating organs?
Well, exactly, because here's the issue. The pikuach nefesh overrides the 3 prohibitions, the triad of taboos of how we have to treat the sanctity of the corpse. But if this person is alive, then you're basically taking out their heart, you're killing them. And so if you don't think the person is alive, you don't kill someone for the sake of pikuach nefesh, right? Save someone else.
So that's how they see it. They see it as you're killing someone to, okay.
Yeah. And they don't always formulate it as murder or anything like that. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they put it as like, we're just not sure enough that this person is dead. So the person is not dead. Now you could say, well, wait a minute, but a person who's brain dead has never, ever, ever, ever woken up. It never has happened. Occasionally there'll be, once in a blue moon, there'll be a misdiagnosis, and then we'll look over afterwards and see, oh, you didn't do the proper testing. But this has been well studied and well documented in many, many proper professional journals. When the proper testing is done, and usually proper testing is done, right? No one has ever woken up. And you can understand why, because they're unresponsive to their environment, and the blood flow has stopped to the brain. So when the blood flow is stopped to the brain, after a few days, right, on average, the heart's going to stop as well. So you could ask the following question. Well, can a person give up their own last minutes of life when they're unconscious and will never wake up again in order to save up to 8 people's lives? I'll give you a following example. Suppose you're in a hospital in Israel. I'm using Israel for a reason, okay? And it could be Montreal as well, but let's go with Israel. And you have a patient who's brain dead. Okay, let's call the patient Rabbi. And there are 8 people in the room. There's the doctor, the mother, the father, the nurse, this or that. And suddenly a grenade gets thrown into the room. And they can't run. And someone says, take Roi's body and throw it onto the grenade. Would you do it? What if in his lifetime, Roi had said, if I am brain dead and there are 8 people in the room and a grenade gets thrown into the room, throw my body onto the grenade. Now, I didn't pick the name Roi coincidentally. Of course, I'm also invoking Roi Klein, who in the Second Lebanon War is leading his men. Lebanon is in a room, a grenade gets thrown into the room, and he jumps on it, screams out Shema Yisrael, jumps on it, takes the blow, dies immediately, everyone else is saved. So that's a different type of argument which you could make in this case and say, listen, even if the person's we're not sure they're dead, but a person can choose to give up what's known in halachic terms as chaye shah, very few last moments of life in order to save others. It's just a dangerous argument to make because once you go down that road, right, then when else are you going to allow it, right? So it's a little bit of a tricky argument to make, but I do think that is a factor why religious Zionist rabbis have partly accepted this notion, because in Israel, in the army culture, you accept this notion of self-sacrifice.
One more question. They're willing to take organs from people. Do they have to be Jewish people, Jewish organs?
No.
Okay.
No. Yeah, that's not an issue. That's not an issue. Yeah. I mean, you occasionally you hear people wonder about that. That's really not the issue. I don't think this is a racial or ethnic thing or anything along those lines. Okay. And by the way, one of the miracles of Israel is that Jews and Arabs, Muslims, Christians, whatever it might be, donate and receive from each other. You know, I mean, well, a guy I was in yeshiva with, Yoni Jesner, Lava Shalom, was killed in a bus bombing in 2001 in Tel Aviv. And one of his organs went to a Palestinian, not just Israeli Arab, but Palestinian. So it's a pretty remarkable thing in general. Okay, so where does this whole debate come from? So here it's a little bit tricky, but I want to show you briefly a Talmudic passage, okay, which tells us the following. Let's see if I can share here. Here we go. So the Talmudic passage is in Masechet Yoma, right, where we're discussing the following question. There's been an avalanche, right, and someone's buried underneath. And it's Shabbat. Now, normally in Shabbat, we don't move rocks, do malacha. But in order to save someone's life, we would do it. But let's say you see the body. Unfortunately, we're going to think of images right now from Turkey. Right? But let's say you see the body and you don't know is this person alive or dead. So the Gemara says we check up to the nose and see, that's how we can tell if the person is alive. And until that point, though, we'll violate Shabbat in order to save the person's life. Now, what are they checking for at the nose? And this is, by the way, is brought down the Halakha, right, in Jewish law. The nose is where we look to detect life. Shulchan Aruch says here on the bottom of the screen, if no life is detectable at the nose, he's certainly dead, whether they reached him head first or feet first, right? It doesn't matter which way we go, we get to the nose, that's where we check it. So I think it's pretty clear. What are they checking for? Breathing. And this is what's known as the feather test, right? In the old days, right, you would take, you put a piece of paper, right, up to someone's nose and you'd see, right, it's a little bit too thick, but you get the idea. And you'd see, right, if you see breathing, if you see the movement in the feather, right, so that would be an indication that the person is alive. Now, the person is unresponsive, and we now have this test to see if they're breathing. Now, that's a test, but is the test reflective of a larger criteria, an understanding that this is what counts as death? So if you look back in the Talmud, they give an explanation. Why do we check the nose? And it says here, Abba Shaul, right in the middle of the page, it says, well, look in the Bible. If you look in Genesis, Parshat Noach, when we're told that how does life get brought into a person, is being brought into the nose, the nostrils, is where we breathe the Ruach Chaim, right? And think about, by the way, in the Hebrew word for soul is neshama. What is that connected to? Neshima, breathing. Right? So you could say what the Talmud is trying to tell us here isn't just a test. How do we check to see if we're not sure a person is alive or dead? Because we don't know otherwise. It's giving us a criterion for death. Respiration is the key sign of life or death. And some indeed understood the Talmud to be doing exactly this, to be teaching us that there's a criteria for death, and if respiration has never going to happen again, and the person is unresponsive to their environment, they are dead. But others say, no, what the Talmud was telling us here was just if there are no signs of life. We need to know one way or the other, so you test by the nose. But if there are signs of life, then that's not a criteria. Then the person's not dead. And so if the heart is still beating, I don't care if the fact that they won't have autonomous respiration ever again. And I don't care about the fact that they're only staying alive because powerful technology. At the end of the day, there's a sign of life. There's a sign of life. They're alive. Now, of course, the Talmud wasn't thinking, right, about modern day technology and the way we understand how the body works today. But, you could say that this is a legitimate source in which there's a legitimate dispute about what Judaism thinks is the criteria for death. Now, I actually think, you could read the Talmud in both ways. I happen to feel that if we're going to understand it to mean that death is respiratory criteria, in order to receive organs, we have to feel that way for donating organs as well. Okay, which is why, in our organization, we've pushed and promoted halachic organ donation for a long time. And by the way, it's very interesting. There's a model which I agree with a lot in some ways, which is the model of the Sydney Bezdin. Okay, the Sydney Bezdin is run by some senior Chabad poskim. I mean, they have to be Chabad, but they're much broader. Rabbi Ullman and Rabbi Gutnick. And I've gotten to Rabbi Ullman last couple of months. A very, very impressive posek. And he said the following, he said, listen, we're not going to solve this debate because the Talmudic passage isn't so clear. But I will tell you that if you want to donate, we will support you and we'll give you chizuk and we'll make sure the process is done right because this is a legitimate halachic option. And that is really where I feel on this issue, well, I can't say that's absolutely for sure that the Talmud gave us a clear respiratory criteria for death. It's a very compelling argument. It's not a perfect argument by any means. And since we're willing to accept it in order to save lives, or save our own lives, we should also be willing to accept it in order to allow people the option to donate as well. And that's why we encourage, organ donation. And, I respect other positions. I get there's other positions out there. I don't want to fight with anyone about it. This issue getting very heated and political in certain circles, rabbinic circles. But if push comes to shove, I respect other positions. But my position is, my belief is that this is certainly a legitimate halachic option. I encourage people to do it. And I want to stress one other factor, and I'll open up to more questions, which I only really fully understood once I took over this organization. And I really started to meet people and talk to a lot of people in the field of organ donation. Remember I said beforehand, many times organ donation happens after sudden deaths, car accidents, bike accidents, aneurysms, etc. And you're faced at this moment, this terrible, terrible moment, and all of a sudden, boom, suddenly this happens. And there's this opportunity to save someone's life or multiple lives. And you're trying to find some sense of meaning at that moment. And for many, many families, it is tremendously meaningful to feel that the life of their loved one goes on. And that the final act of their loved one before they go up to Shemayim was this tremendous, tremendous mitzvah of saving someone else's life, which at the end of the day, the vast majority of us, especially if we're not healthcare professionals or emergency personnel, never get to do that mitzvah. And here, this is this tremendous, tremendous mitzvah that person go up to Shemayim with and to save other people's lives. And this is a tremendous source of nechama, of comfort to people. And so, I always tell people, you're not sure. I'm very sure how I feel about this. I told my family, they know. But if you're not sure, definitely don't rule it out, because if God forbid it comes up and the moment of truth occurs, it is a tremendous opportunity and source of nechama to be able to save other people's lives. It doesn't bring back your loved one, but certainly, it's a very powerful, powerful moment. So that's sort of our take on organ donation. And, when it comes to public policy issues, I think it's fascinating. How do you have a situation where such a heated debate is unanimously supported one side by the religious Zionist rabbis? Hard for me to explain it other way, except for the fact that if you have to control and run a society and have responsibility for a full medical system, health system, it's hard you can't waver on this. You can't be not sure on this. Questions? A heavy topic, I know. I should develop some jokes to bring on this conversation, but that's. Go ahead, Michaela.
No, it's very heavy, but it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Because I know for years you could never donate organs. I know that for years. And my mother always said one day she wanted to donate hers. And she did pass away. And I don't even know if she didn't donate hers, but I know it's a heavy topic and it's hard to, I'm not being honest, it's kind of hard to sit and listen to, but I think it's very important.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard. It's really hard. It's a hard topic to, we sort of hope and pray that it doesn't come up. Now, I should say that we're not going to discuss this now, but the technology has advanced a lot. So first of all, people can be organ donors at a much older age than they used to be. And the technology is advancing in interesting ways where I actually think that even after cardiac death, which is what happens most times, right? What I mean by that is that the way we can tell that a person is dead through the cessation of the heartbeat, there's going to be more opportunities for organs to be retrieved even after cardiac death in the coming years. And it could be that will be a source of organs to help people. There also is a lot of experimentation of 3D, artificial organs, 3D organs. And then there's a lot of experimentation with xenotransplantation, where they're basically growing pig hearts or pig organs and trying to manipulate them in ways that they can transplant and that the human body will accept it. It's very hard because the human body will see that as a foreign source. So your immune system kicks in. So there's a lot of work being done there. They did it successfully in Baltimore last year. The patient died soon afterwards, but I think the patient was also very sick. And it's hard to experiment here, right? Because the person's so sick, that's why you're willing to take the chance of this working. So, there's a lot of technology that's being developed right now that could help deal with this issue, but it's gonna be a while still.
What is the feeling about medically induced death? What are the positions that are being taken?
So we're going to talk about this a little bit next week at greater length, but I'll put it out here now. If you, in many cases, again, depends on the condition of the body, right? So Michaela, you're talking about, I'm asking about your mom, I'm saying, but most times when people live long in an older age and they have some form of health conditions and history, you're not going to be able to donate organs. But there are times, let's say, when, let's say you have a 60-year-old who's got Lou Gehrig's disease, right? ACL. And so their body, actually, the organs can be in great shape. There are other health issues. And so they decide at some point to remove the ventilator, to pull the plug, so to speak. Okay. Now, in many countries now, not in Israel, but in many countries, including Canada, there is an opportunity to do this in a controlled manner in which you remove the ventilator, you wait for cardiac arrest, you give about 2-3 minutes, depends on the country, sometimes longer. Of course, if you wait too long and there's no blood flow, those organs aren't going to be usable. That's always the sensitive, how long you wait. And then you basically not blast, that's the wrong term here, but you inject the body with a tremendous amount of air through what's known as an ECMO machine. You get the organs moving again, vital again, and then you retrieve them. This is a technology that's being used now a lot. In some, I forget now the Canadian stats. I looked this up last week, but in England, for example, almost 50% of the organs are being recovered in that situation. In California, I think it's 40%, and there are various, variations in different countries. And that's being a big source, but the problem there is you're withdrawing care in a way that's going to cause the person to die, which is going to raise other ethical and halakhic issues. Okay, so we'll talk about a bit more of that next week. Now, in the case of euthanasia organ donation, this is not withdrawing care, right? It's not a case of withdrawing care. This is a case of, basically a person saying, I don't want to keep on going in my condition, and I want you to inject me with something, right, that will kill me, but do it in a controlled manner so you can also, as soon as I die, retrieve the organs as well. This is also going on, not only in Canada, but also in Holland, the Netherlands, wherever basically euthanasia is legalized. This is going on. Again, the problem isn't that the person isn't dead. The problem is that you're doing something to cause the person to die, which raises other issues, which we'll get into next week. But that certainly is, it's an interesting phenomenon but it raises a lot of questions right away, because this has always been an interesting dilemma of organization. You should know there are some ethicists when organization started who basically said, don't go down this road. Don't do it. Because once you start playing with people's bodies and sort of trying to exactly determine when is the moment of death, you're inevitably going to make that line fuzzy. And you're inevitably going to start thinking in utilitarian terms, which isn't about the integral sanctity of a person's life and the inherent prohibition of killing, but you're going to start thinking of, is this life worth living anymore? Wouldn't it be better for those organs to be in someone else's body? And it raises, and we're down, and we didn't accept that argument. We said we need we want to save lives. And people thought that's too far of a slippery slope. We are well down the slope at this point. Well down the slope at this point. So, it raises very, very deep and profound and difficult questions. Really difficult questions. Terry.
What about cremation? I heard that, it's on the rise amongst Jews.
Cremation is on the rise amongst Jews.
Are you getting more candidates?
I'm sorry?
Are you getting more candidates because they want to be cremated and they don't care about being buried whole?
Yeah, it's interesting. Hard to know exactly. I mean, the numbers of Jews who are willing to be organ donors has certainly gone up. And part of that's educating people, right? Even, from who are very committed religiously. I suspect part of it is also, that people just aren't that Jewish anymore, to put it that way, right? In terms of their practice and their beliefs. Cremation, I don't know what it's like in Canada right now. I was actually talking to someone today, last week, who was telling me that's not like what's like in the States. In the States right now, in the non-Orthodox world, probably half of Jews are getting cremated. That's what we think the numbers are right now. And maybe a little bit less, a little more. It's hard to know exactly, but cremation is totally on the rise. Totally on the rise. And there's some people that are very upset about this. They have this whole campaign against it. I'm not happy about it, but I sort of feel like when people don't live their lives that Jewish, so to speak, in terms of their beliefs and actions, it's not shocking that they're going to follow the general trend, which is also a lot cheaper to have cremation. So, now they're into human composting. This is the newest trend, which, yeah. I'll leave it at there. I can't believe that so soon after the Holocaust even, right, that cremation has become like a Jewish thing. You see it a little bit in Israel now, a little bit, but very little, very, very little. There's whole controversy, but you see very little there. Anyone got a good joke? Sorry, I don't have any good cremation jokes, to go with here. All right. Well, next we'll have a lighter topic of euthanasia. So that'll be Susan.
I just want to say that the way you've presented this has clarified in my mind how to think about it further in such a way that's amazing. And what I'm thinking is there's so many people who don't understand so many of the things that you've said. And when people are asked, you're sent a card, will you donate your organs? It's like, whoa, wait a minute, they're going to kill me. And so if people were informed, if they were making informed consent to this, I don't know how, maybe that will happen more and more as organizations like yours are out there speaking more. But if there were more written for people to read and discussion points of some of the things you've touched on, I think that would help inform people and help them make good decisions.
Well, there's no doubt. Thank you, first of all, I appreciate it. And there's no doubt that education is super important here. And being able to talk about it within your own family.
I think that being able to talk about it, like the education piece, some people are so educated or within their family or within their group. No, it's a taboo, like you said. And I think it's more the permission to talk about it and say, whoa, wait a minute, which seems to come really across very well in your presentation.
So I think that one of the reasons why we've expanded our organization from organ donation to end-of-life care as a whole is precisely because of this issue.
Mhm.
That we discovered that you can't separate those issues. If you want people to talk about organ donation, you got to talk about the whole package of end of life, which is really hard for people to talk about. Not just Jews, right? For everyone.
Mhm.
But if you don't talk about those things, you're not going to be able to have informed decisions, to be made. And that's the most important thing to do. I mean, signing organ donor cards is of value, but there are people who are very weary of signing over anything to the government and any powers like that. Whatever, it is what it is. I'm not gonna, and maybe that's legitimate, maybe it's not. I'm not so concerned about it, but okay, whatever it is. The most important thing, though, is to make sure your family knows what you'd want and to talk about it. And I tell people whenever I give this share, and discuss this, I said, listen, you go home, you forget any other share I give. I don't care. I mean, I do care, but I tell them that, right? But this year, do me a favor. Find an opportunity in the next couple of days, take 5 minutes and talk to your loved ones about how you feel about this, what they would feel about this, what it might be, because, and then hope and pray it doesn't come relevant. But because if it does become relevant, it is so, so important to have thought about this beforehand. You become such a more informed and, knowledgeable, it's not just knowledge, but empowered decision maker when you've talked about this beforehand. But this is true about many other issues, resuscitation and intubation, and we'll talk about a little bit more of that next week. But all these issues, no one likes talking about it. But, and we're working on this. I mean, I'm working on a whole new living will right now, which I will hope to make like super easy, for people to fill out and have a conversation, have a website and videos that, that make it easy for people to understand the concepts that are going on. Because, it's very hard to, even if you want to talk about it, how do you talk about these issues, right? You need to have a primer. You need something to give you a sense of okay, these are the issues we should talk about. And that's very hard. And there are such materials out there in the world, of course, but a lot of those things aren't necessarily culturally sensitive, if you will, to the Jewish community. So we're working on all of this. I mean, we're working on it here. Look.
Oh, wow.
Have your new living will. We explain a little bit who you should designate as a proxy, and if you want to have a rabbi that they consult with, organization, of course, is there. I'll show you. And then we make it nice and simple, big words, right? This is your proxy, how you relate to the person.
Yeah.
Right? Do you want a rabbi involved that's consulted? You don't have to, but if you do, and I'll tell you why that's important. Because, many of us can have multiple rabbis in our lives. And their kids have the rabbis. And we have 4 kids. One's ultra-Orthodox, one's not religious, 2, whatever this and that, whatever it is, you get the point. There's 7 rabbis can be consulted. Who do you want them to call up? You should decide that, right? I mean, you literally, people in general, right? And then, but that's a very simple document. It's simple. We make it really easy. A little bit about handling their body, but that's very, and then where it gets more interesting is conversation primer. Let people know how you think, your values in general. This isn't a legal document. This is meant to be how do I think about these types of issues, right? And so we ask people, what do you think about pain and risk? How do you think about these issues? And you can't make these decisions ahead of time, right? Because you don't know what's going to be per se. But you can give a little bit of a feel of what you feel about pain relief, right? What types of risks you want to do. And you invoke when you have those conversations. I was upset about how Aunt Sarah died when they did all those procedures on her for no reason. I was happy the way David died, my friend, whatever it might be, right? We all have our encounters with it. And we give people the ability to, how much do you want to know? And so on. So we're trying to make this nice and easy, check boxes, and then give people conversations. And
So does that exist already, or that's just in the works?
it exists on my computer. I
Okay.
now have sent it to a Canadian, I have Canadian lawyers working on this. I have American lawyers working on this. I'm about to get to the British lawyers. Please God, the lawyers will take care of this soon enough. Because you got to make sure this is written, done very carefully. Otherwise, I don't have a situation where someone uses this document
Yeah, and
and
then,
it's not executable in Quebec, even though it's usable in Toronto, right? Like that would be disaster. Whatever. So, so we're working on that. It would make it nice and easy if all of Canada would use the same rules.
what about every city or every town in one city would use the same?
Right. So I'm not holding my breath for that. So that's not the case. So I'm having people review this, and we think in the next couple of months, our new website will be up in 2 weeks, and we think in the next couple of months we'll be able to launch this document, which I hope will be very beneficial. I'll send it to Rabbi Schreier, of course, and Rabbi Schreier, and he'll have it. Rabbi Fishman.
I have a relevant, very, very, very short story. I have a friend in the States, and there's a Zoom group I belong to, and she's part of it. I'm from Toronto, actually. And we were having actually this conversation in our group. And she said, my husband and I invited our 2 sons over because we decided somebody like you perhaps had lectured to them that you have to have this talk with your children, not just hope that everything will work out well. They invited their 2 sons over for brunch, and they sat them down at the table, and they said, okay, the reason you're here is this is what we want to talk to you about. And they pulled out these papers and pulled out their topics and how they were going to discuss it about end of life decisions. The sons looked at each other. Their faces were green at that point. They both stood up and said, sorry, we're not staying for brunch. We can't even look at this topic. So the message is, it's hard on your kids.
It is hard, but I will tell you what's even harder is when the doctors say to you, should we do CPR? And the siblings look at each other and are like, and you have to live with that.
Yeah.
That's really hard.
Yeah.
And ultimately what's going to make this successful is we get to a tipping point where it's just sort of like a thing where you're expected in your community once a year. Shabbos Vayechi, right? End of life of Jacob, right? Whatever it is. You got to make sure you have these conversations, you have it in order. That's hard because like people walk out of shul for Yisker if they have their parents are alive, and we whisper the tochacha in shul, right? Because like, it's like cancer, right? Like we don't talk like we have all these things that are cultural barriers, which in our day and age are really, are big mistakes, So please God, we'll advance the cause. All right.
Thank you very much.
On that note, have a great week, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.